So here is our video on the triangle trade as promised. This is our fourth video for Unit 2. Now we already discussed the triangle trade in class a bit. You did that assignment with the two triangles, so this should be a bit of review. Your left side today is you need to make a chart with 4 causes and effects that you find from the video. I won't say a cause and effect, you have to sort of figure it out. So an example would be, it mentions the British Council findings on slavery. An effect would be that they abolished the slave trade. Okay, so like I said, we did this a bit in class already, and I want you to think about the things we learned about previously, such as colonization in the Americas, things like the encomienda system, things like plantation labor, and see how that leads to what we're discussing here today. So, all right, the demand for labor in the Western Hemisphere, which would be the New World, stimulated a profitable three-legged trading pattern. So here we go, the triangle trade. There's 3 parts. And European, which had the factories and the industry, they had manufactured goods, which they brought to Africa in exchange for slaves. The slaves went to the Caribbean and the Americas, where they were sold to do the plantation labor, and the fruits of their labor were then brought the other leg of the journey. So to make it simple here, the triangle trade means that there's 3 points of departure and arrival. And specifically, the triangle trade refers to this era of colonization, of the slave trade, and plantation labor. So there's a few different legs of the slave trade, or a few different versions, shall I say, of the slave trade. This is the one we focus the most on in our unit, the one from Europe to Africa and the Americas. You'll learn about a different type in US 1, where it refers more directly to the northern colonies. But this one refers more to the Americas, as in the Caribbean or South America, such as Brazil. So now let's focus on the slave trade part of the triangle trade. In 1528, after the encomienda system is abolished, the Spanish government offered contracts for private companies to trade in African slaves. Portugal, however, soon really commanded the slave trade, and it was basically a Portuguese monopoly. Remember when we did the Age of Exploration, the Dutch and then the English replaced Portugal as dominating trade, so here they began to also dominate the slave trade. By the time the British dominated the slave trade, however, they realized how many Africans were dying in the slave trade, and within about a decade or two, they ended up abolishing the slave trade and urged other countries to follow. We'll discuss the middle passage, and that is the leg from Africa to the Americas, where the Africans were on board. Most estimates now think that about half of them died on the journey, either from when they were taken in Africa to the African coastline or actual on the journey across the Americas. There's stories of how people on these slaving ships kept journals, and they noted that sharks were always following their ship because so many slaves died aboard the ship that when they tossed them overboard, there was always food for the sharks, and that would be why they followed. This is a pretty famous image when people learn about the slave trade, and if you'll see, it shows how tightly packed the Africans were aboard these ships. One of the several reasons as to why the middle passage was so deadly. Right? Imagine being chained and cramped in these conditions. We're going to read and watch part of Roots by Alex Haley, which will show that as well. Now, these 2 images are from the maps in our classroom, so hopefully you get up and get a chance to look at it. These different colors of triangle shows the 3 different types of the triangle trade. Once again, we focus mostly on the blue triangle for what we're covering. Next year, you'll focus more on the yellow and also a bit of the red triangle. But see how they are all somewhat similar and how it all depended on slave labor. This map in our room also shows where most of the slaves were taken to. Notice that most slaves were actually taken to Brazil. All right, we'll see you next class.